sort of that freedom kind of thing.
It wasn't that there wasn't a
Not
good band.
hippie-ish or anything.
I mean, there's always Aerosmith and AC/DC were still around. They're great bands, but I think kids, you know, in the late '80s here didn't really have a band who were their peers to cling on to or whatever, you know.
Man, that's the kind of chemistry that you can't buy that. It just happens. And sometimes it lasts a long time, and sometimes it lasts for an instant. But they had it. They complemented one another.
I think they are the act that they are because they were better. They were just better. More talented, more skill, more charisma. They just had it all.
Guns N' Roses were now undeniably massive. Their repackaged Lies EP went on to sell quantities far in excess of most bands' proper albums. What with such a level of ubiquity, many would have thought that a backlash would be inevitable. This did not, however, prove to be entirely the case.
There's no question that the paradigm that Guns N' Roses got caught up in as time went on was very much a 1990s paradigm of the mainstream versus the margins. But I actually think that if you look at where they started, and you look at heavy metal, and you look at Los Angeles, you're actually not talking about places where anyone had a problem with being successful. I mean, the notion of that there was something to be embarrassed about where success was concerned, that was really much more of a kind of avant-garde rock notion, a college rock notion.
Guns N' Roses was what a lot of people aspired to. They really broke through, and they were leading the crowd.
In LA, we were so happy that somebody was actually taking the torch and continuing the metal glam scene, because if Guns N' Roses hadn't come along when they did, the LA glam scene would have been gone years prior. But Guns N' Roses, in my opinion, and because I was there, they kept the scene alive for, I don't know, another 3 to 5 years, and otherwise it would have perished before that, and it would have been a real drag.
There was a pretty tight network of dudes, and when one of them out of the masses would shoot up to stardom, of course there's going to be resentment, because you were going to Rock and Roll Denny's on Sunset Boulevard with that dude the night before. You were going to Cantor's. You were living probably in the same apartment complex with a guy from Quiet Riot or a guy from Winger, and you were partying with them at the Jet Boy show at the Cat House. They were all in this tight network, in each other's faces day in and day out. Not only on the scene, not only at the recording studios. I mean, in their everyday life, it was, the whole city was taken over by these guys with teased hair and leather jackets. So when one of them would crawl out of the the lobster cage, of course the rest of them are going to try to pull that dude back in. And especially when you're an inflammatory person to begin with. You're kind of an abrasive dude, like Axl was.
Despite having the world at their feet, it would be a further 3 years before Guns N' Roses unveiled their next project. It would prove to be a turbulent time for the band, non-stop touring accompanied by a number of personal problems, which would eventually result in the dismissal of drummer Steven Adler, to be replaced by former Cult member Matt Sorum.
When GNR first started recording what were to be the Use Your Illusion albums, Steven Adler was still very much the drummer, but they'd had problems with him for a long time. He had a heavy drug dependency. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment the rest of the band were completely clean, because they were not. In fact, there was a famous incident in Los Angeles when GNR opened for the Rolling Stones in the summer of 1989, when Axl pretty much went on stage and said, "This is it, the band are over," because 1 or 2 members of this band can't actually get off their drugs. And he was talking about Izzy and Slash, not Adler.
Steven Adler was becoming a problem, was apparently drugged out and drunk a lot and couldn't play.
When Steve got thrown out of the band, I think when Matt's a great drummer and all, but it just didn't have, Steve had the special beat that wasn't so, I think Matt's a good player, but he's kind of more of a machine, like not as much feel. Steve was not as good of a drummer, but had a much better feel, and once you took out one of the ingredients in the band, I think it never was the same again. I believe the first, the original lineup was Guns N' Roses.
Matt Sorum, who came from the Cult and was a great drummer.
And on the drums, here to turn your brains into mashed rice, is Mr. Matt Sorum.
musically at the time, I think they were in peak form. Slash, drunk as he was an exceptional guitar player. When you hear Slash play guitar, you know that's Slash, and that's what makes a good guitar player.
Slash was apparently at the height of his heroin addiction. So that, coupled with the fact that they were still touring for Appetite quite a long time after it had been released, meant they were writing on the road a lot. And really, it's quite a surprise that they ever got a very good album out of it, because everything was kind of haphazard in the way it came together.
Right before Use Your Illusion, they just started writing. You know, they were also writing, I think, on the road too. You know, but Axl's always had like lyrics and stuff in his head anyway, so he always jots stuff down.
They made Illusion here. Mike Klink, their producer, was based here, and the band recorded here. The Use Your Illusion sessions were not by any means normal. They didn't have a real strict time constraint. As the band toured so much, they started to put their material together, and they discovered that the Appetite and the Lies EP were just a small amount of the material that they had laying around. So they went back and they looked at all of the songs, and they said, we're going to record them all, we're going to make 2 double albums. And there was a great hubris, musical, creative hubris about GNR at that time. Because when you're on top of the world, then you can do whatever you want to do. So they began the process with their producer of creating this record. And it took quite a long time to put Illusion together.
They were looking for a place to mix Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. That they could be off the radar screen. They also had a number of tracks, so they needed an extremely large frame console. And in those days, a big console was a 72 channel. And I had one of only 2 80s in town. Guns N' Roses in those days were over the top popular. I mean, they couldn't go anywhere. And if they'd be at a studio and anybody knew they were at the studio, there'd be 40 people outside of it. So we were always a low-profile studio, and they just decided to come here so that they could do it in private. Anytime you're working with a band that big, it's going to take some time to mix a record, no matter what the circumstances are.
There was continuous talk that the record was being delayed, and Axl was really upset that anyone would say it was delayed. It couldn't be delayed because it wasn't finished yet, and he was very vocal about the fact that he wasn't in it for anybody but the fans. He wanted to give the fans the best package.
Use Your Illusion was originally mixed by Bob Clearmountain, who had worked with the Stones on down. I mean, he is a legendary mixer. But when Slash and Axl heard the mixes, they thought the record sounded too clean, too slick. And as good as Use Your Illusion sounds sonically, the original mixes were way cleaner. They went after Bill Price, the Sex Pistols mixer.
They tested just about everybody in town and throughout the world to who they wanted to have mix this, and it ended up that Bill Price was giving them the closest thing to what they were looking for. Bill is a brilliant mixer. He did Rock the Casbah and a whole host of records. Brilliant engineer and an extremely cool guy, which you need to have with a group like Guns N' Roses. You know, somebody who doesn't become part of the crazy process and is always bringing it home. My interaction was way more with Bill than it was with the group. Since the process took 6 months, there was times when the group was here and then times when they were out on the road performing. So early on, the group was here and coming in and listening to the mixes and that sort of thing. And then later on in the summer when they were on tour, we would have to FedEx what we considered to be a final mix to wherever they were. Gee, they're going to be in St. Louis tomorrow, so let's FedEx the mix to the Bonaventure in St. Louis or wherever they were staying, and then we'd wait to hear back from them. That certainly added to the time that it took to mix it, because we didn't necessarily get an answer back in 10 minutes. Sometimes it was 2 days.
With mixing on the albums drawing to a close, it soon became official news. There was not only one, but 2 Guns N' Roses double albums on the way. Expectations were being formed. With the long and uneven history of the double album, many were wondering exactly how the band would tackle the format.
If you go back to the history of double albums, the first ever recorded double album was Benny Goodman at Carnegie Hall. It's the first time anybody ever put out a double album. And then in rock and roll was Bob Dylan. You got Blonde on Blonde. And then so many other double albums have come. And usually by a record company standard, you know, that's like, could be a kiss of death.
There was already the rumors after Appetite hit that, you know, they were starting to get a little bit too rock star. They were starting to get self-indulgent. They were going to get over-bloated. They were going to try to go different places musically than they should, and they were losing their street cred. And then, you know, the rumors start to come out. And you got to remember, there's a huge gap of time between Appetite and when the actual Use Your Illusion album comes out. The buzz starts early, but the gap is big. And during that time, there's all this speculation, and then you start to hear double album, and you go, uh-oh.
I think once You Could Be Mine came out, people kind of warmed to the idea of a lot of material, and they're also eager to hear how most bands would do 10 to 12 songs on an album. Suddenly this band's got 30 odd songs and they're willing to release a lot. I think that created excitement rather than trepidation. And once the single was out and people knew how good it was, they were just itching to hear the rest of it.
And You Could Be Mine was a huge hit, radio hit. I mean, that was, people were already, you know, excited by that point.
I thought that's where they've been hiding. They've been writing songs all this time, and they just had so many different tracks to get out that one album wasn't enough.
Before the albums emerged, however, Guns N' Roses would be embarking on their mammoth promotional tour 4 months prior to release date. As well as providing the first chance to hear new material, it also promised the fans a live experience unlike anything they had seen before.
Die-hard fans are already camping out to get front row positions.
Oh, they've got a pretty cool sort of attitude. They don't sort of really care what people think of them, and they say what they think. And
they're not hurting anyone, and it gives a lot of people a lot of outlet for their own aggression and stuff.
Today, the huge stage and lighting structure went up.
It's one of the largest stages ever built in this country. The whole stage structure is over 100 metres across. We've worked hard to make sure that the people are well catered for, well policed, and looked after, basically.
Among those looking after concert goers will be more than 200 police and up to 400 security guards, just to make sure the fans at least stay under control.
Fired up and ready to go, the group hit the road, now joined by pianist Dizzy Reed.
Axl called me up once and he said, okay, we're going on tour and we're going to bring a piano player on tour, so I wanted you to be the piano player, but I promised Dizzy that if we ever go on tour, he's going to be the piano player. So, and I'm like, oh, thanks. And so you could have been the huge... So that's when they started doing their own tour and being the headliner. And it just got so big and wonderful.
The growing scale of things would take its toll. Before the year was out, guitarist and songwriter Izzy Stradlin, despite having worked extensively on the new albums, would throw in the towel. He was replaced by Gilby Clarke.